Hi everyone, welcome back to Full Deco. Today I will show you how to turn this acrylic block, clear acrylic block, into this block, which is a jewelry organizer made with real flowers. So in this video, I will go over how to make a mold, how to dry flowers with silica gel, and how to cast flowers in resin. But before we begin, I just want to let you know that I just launched a Patreon where I will be posting exclusive content as well as offer you discount codes to shop my art at elapol.com, as well as my mold shop, Elapol Molds, on Etsy, and my Specs and Soul shop on Etsy, where I sell my eco-friendly resin art. I will leave all the links to the Patreon and the shops in the description, so I hope to see you there. And without further ado, let's get started. We will be drying our flowers in this bin. It's a scrapbook paper storage bin that I got from Michael's. I love this for drying smaller and flatter flowers because it's not too deep. This is our petite bouquet that I got from my local Trader Joe's. I love Trader Joe's for flowers because they're so pretty and affordable. If you have one nearby, it's totally worth checking out for the flowers. I have recharged silica gel stored in a bin, and I will fill a layer about ½ inch deep with the silica gel to place my flowers on top of. I normally don't use the stems in my work, so I use a scissor to cut the blooms off. You can put the stems in silica gel as well, but I think they might take longer to dry because it's a long piece and I'm not sure if the silica gel can get to the center of it. They definitely dry over time though, so you can keep the stems on your flowers if you want to incorporate them in your pieces. I would leave them in the silica gel for longer just in case if I had the stems on. As I am placing my flowers, I make sure that they are spread out and that I will have enough space for the silica gel to get into every single petal of my flowers. Once I place all of the flowers, I will add more silica to cover them completely. Watch how I am covering the flowers. I will pour a little bit of silica at a time and then give the bin a shake to even out the layer that I just poured in. That will fill in any gaps between the flowers and the silica that was just poured. It's just to make sure that the entire flower, all the petals and in between, will be covered in silica to dry. Since we are preserving these flowers in epoxy, any moisture in the flowers can cause it to rot over time, and we don't want that to happen. Once we fill our bin, don't forget to label and date it. We will let the flowers rest for 4 weeks before opening up this bin again. I had forgotten to date this bin, but I did do it afterwards off camera. As you can see, I dried these flowers a long time ago. The date of this clip, where I am revealing the dried flowers, is March 25th. I didn't really have any ideas for this bouquet at the time, so I kept these dried flowers in an airtight bin with some fresh silica gel until they were ready to be used. Notice how these flowers dried so nicely. They retained their colors really well in the silica gel, and that's why I love using silica gel for drying flowers. Not to mention, using silica gel, we can keep the form of the flowers to be 3D. These would definitely look really pretty preserved in epoxy. Here's a close-up of the dried flowers, and they look pretty much the same as if they were fresh. On to the mold making part. I found this acrylic block on Amazon and I thought the size was perfect for a wall hanging jewelry organizer. The depth is perfect for our flowers as well. I 3D printed a mold housing based on the size of this block, and we are using oracles or masking film as a base. I placed my acrylic blank and my mold housing. I tried to make sure that the blank is as center as possible for maximum support on all sides of the mold. Here I just want to point out that I am using my nails to press against the edge of the housing and the tape. That is to make sure that the housing is fully secured to the tape. I can't flip it around to show you or else the block might fall. It's actually pretty heavy. If the housing is not fully closed to the tape, you might end up with silicone leaking, and silicone is expensive. You can always add hot glue around the edges just in case, or you can pour a thin layer first to secure your master and the housing to the tape, then fill it up. I have poured silicone molds in multiple layers, same silicone for all layers, and it has worked for me. So now we're going to mix up our silicone, and I'm using a toteable mixing cup. It has measurements already on the cup, and we'll be using them as a guide to measure out the two parts. The silicone that we're using for this video is a kit from Start Sew World that I got off Amazon. It's a 1-to-1 ratio silicone measured by volume. I will link the silicone in the description if you want to try it out. I normally use a different silicone, but for this video, I wanted to use something that you can easily have access to off Amazon, and I think it's not too pricey starting out. My go-to silicone is Smooth On's Dragon Skin 20, and it's pretty thick, and it has a much shorter working time, so it's not very beginner friendly. But I do have a different mold making video where I work with that silicone if you want to check that out after this video. Once I measured out my two parts, I added some mica powder to tint the silicone. You don't have to tint your silicone, you can leave it translucent. And then I use a drill with a paint mixer attachment to fully mix the two parts. This silicone is actually pretty thin, so you could easily mix this by hand. The mixer will just speed it up. One reason why I like to use mica powder actually is as an indicator that the two parts of the silicone is fully mixed. I mixed for about 2 to 3 minutes. For my usual silicone, I use a vacuum chamber to make sure it's as close to bubble free as possible, so I am doing it in this video. I sped up this part of the video, but the process for this usually takes 5 minutes. As I mentioned before though, the silicone is thin, so I don't think it's needed, the vacuuming. I also have another video where I work with the silicone and I didn't use a vacuum chamber, and it still all went well. Now the vacuuming is done, and it may look the same in our eyes from when we first put the container in the chamber, but you saw the little bubbles popping earlier and how it cleared up. We are ready to pour our mold now, and we will pour our silicone at a decent height away from the blank. This is to help reduce any bubbles. The demold time in the instructions says 6 hours, but I will actually be back in 12 hours to demold this. I think the ambient temperature matters for this silicone, and it's a little cool down here in my basement, so I will give it some more time to fully cure. If you're using a different silicone, read the instructions for how to work with your silicone. If you get this silicone, also read the instructions before you work with it. Now we're ready to demold the mold. Deeper molds are a little more difficult to demold. This block is slightly over 1 inch deep. I've injured myself demolding deeper molds rushing to push it out, so just take your time with it. We're in the resin room now and we're ready to pour into our new mold. Here's another look at it and set it aside as we mix up our resin. We are going to add a pink and white background layer using our Totable high performance resin, the slow hardener version. This is what the containers look like. This is their gallon size kit and it comes with calibrated pump for easy measuring. One pump part A and one pump part B. Just make sure to keep track of your numbers. We're pouring into a small paper cup and these are about 3 ounces. We don't need much for this layer since it's just the background color. When you mix resin, make sure to mix slow and steady. As always, I will show you the real time and then speed it up to save us some time. Once our resin is mixed up, I will split it into 2 different cups for the 2 different colors, the pink and the white. We will be using Black Diamond Pigment's White Diamond Effect combined with Pastel Pink Acrylic from Michaels to create the pink, and Casting Crafts Opaque White to create the white. I like to mix in the mica powder to the paint and the pigments to give it a little shimmer. I'm not a huge fan of the full shimmery look from mica powders, so I like to add these flat colors and opaque pigments to make the color mixtures more opaque. Before we pour, always clean your mold. We use tape to clean it. This is packaging tape, but you can also use blue painter's tape as well. Now let's pour. I am just pouring the white and the pink randomly, and then I will swirl it around with my mixing stick. The swirls help the colors blend more seamlessly, and you will also notice me using my mixing stick to go around the edges to get any bubbles trapped along the sides at the bottom of the mold. Once we're done pouring, we'll use a heat gun to pop the bubbles at the surface, and we'll let this layer fully cure before we come back for the second one because we are going to be using a different resin for the second layer. Six hours later and the first layer has hardened, we are going to mix up some casting resin for the second layer for our flower placement. Every resin has a different cure time depending on our environment settings, so don't just follow my timing even if you are using the same resin. Always read the instructions to your resin if you're using a different one. For this second layer, we are going to use Totable's thick-set casting resin. This resin allows us to pour up to 1 inch deep, and it's a 3:1 ratio resin if you measure by volume. I will actually be measuring this by weight with a scale, and that ratio is not exactly 3:1. It's 100 to 28. And I measure in grams. 100 grams of part A to 28 grams of part B, and that's exactly what I am measuring out here. These details are in the data sheet for this resin on the Totable website. I will also link the resin in the description. I chose this resin because I can pour deeper and its clarity is really good for flowers. If you decide to try it out, my link will also give you a discount for resin. Again, mix slow and steady like I am doing here on camera to not introduce a ton of bubbles to your mixture. This resin is so thin, it's like water. Keep mixing slowly until your resin is clear and there are no more streaks. I will speed this part up to save us some time. Now we're done mixing and we will let our resin rest for the bubbles to rise to the surface. For this resin, I usually let it rest for about an hour. My room is around 70 degrees. I come back every 10 to 15 minutes and I will use a heat gun to pop the surface bubbles and also quickly heat around the mixing cup to help bring more bubbles to the surface. It's over an hour now and the resin has cleared up a lot and has thickened a bit. Keep in mind that this time depends on how much you're mixing as well. If you're mixing a larger mixture, you'll want to come back earlier because it'll cure faster. Before we pour, we will clean up the edges around the mold. I got some drips from the first layer and they will stick to the next one and show up like little dots. This matters because the next layers are going to be clear. I am using the same packaging tape to clean it up, and as I am picking up the drips with the tape, I am very careful to not lift the mold away from the first layer. Otherwise, resin can seep in and you may end up with weird bumps. All cleaned up and there are no more little drips on the side. We're ready to pour our resin and place our flowers now. These are the flowers that we dried. Keep in mind that these are dried several months ago and just stored in an airtight bin with some silica gel until they are ready to be used, which is now. They look just the same as they were when they were first dried because they were stored properly. Make sure to store your dried flowers in an airtight bin with some silica gel so moisture doesn't get back into it and your hard work doesn't go to waste. We didn't mix up too much resin for this layer because we just want this layer to hold down the flowers. Flowers tend to float in resin, so if we filled it up to the top, the flowers will float above the resin and we will have them peeking out of the mold. So this layer only turned out to be about 1/4 inch deep. Now I am placing my flowers and I don't have any pre-planned placement in mind. I am just letting my hands create freely. The second layer has hardened now, and here is a side view just to show that the flowers are not sticking out of the mold. We're going to fill this mold up to the top with more clear thick-set casting resin, the same resin we used for the second layer. I already mixed up the resin and let it rest so we can just pour for this layer. The tedious part of this layer is the bubbles floating to the surface. There are also going to be bubbles along the edges, so take the mixing stick and go around the edges to bring up any hidden bubbles. Wave a heat gun at the surface to pop any surface bubbles. Check back many times because bubbles will continue to rise to the surface as well, and you can pop those with a heat gun. "48 hours later and the piece has fully hardened. Let's demold this now. I like to leave the last layer of floral blocks curing longer to make sure that it's fully cured. I could have used a little bit more resin in the last layer since some of the roses are popping up, but we will sand this anyways. There is a bit of small bubbles that we will have to patch up. Other than that, this piece looks so cute. I love the light pink background with the pink flowers. The white also looks like clouds in a pink sky. There's a little puffiness to it. There's a lot of pink going on here and I love it. This is so perfect for holding necklaces. Next up, we are going to sand the top to open up the bubbles, flatten the roses a bit, and add our hooks, then do a final top coat. I am using a hand sander with the totally wrong sanding sheet, but it's 800 grits, it's what I have, and we'll make it work. I recently learned that it's best not to go lower than 800 grits when sanding resin pieces, so that's why I'm using this. The sandpaper just sticks to the sander like Velcro. I started sanding and then I realized that I forgot to pour water over my piece to wet sand. I just went along with it. Always wear a mask when you're sanding because of the dust. You can see here that it gets pretty dusty. You don't want to breathe it in. I wiped the block with a wet paper towel to add some moisture to help keep the dust in place, and let's finish up the sanding, then we'll start the drilling. You can see that the bubbles have opened up and we will have to clean it because the sanding dust got into them. Right now I am using a toothpick as an example, but anything that can get into the bubbles will do. I am just quickly showing you how I do it because if the holes are not cleaned, the dust will forever be encased in our piece after the top coat. I spend a lot more time on this step off camera afterwards because it's really important. At least a good 30 minutes to make sure it's as clean as possible. For now, I will show you the drilling process. First, we will drill in the holes and then add in these gold screw hooks that I got on Amazon. They're small and they are perfect for holding necklaces. We are using, I believe, a 5/32 drill bit from this drill bit set. Not sure how the term goes. I attached it to my Black & Decker drill. I used this drill earlier for mixing silicone when we made our mold, and there's so many uses for this drill. It's probably one of my favorite tools. Before we drill our holes, we will use a ruler to help decide where we want to place them. I went with about an inch distance between the hooks. You can add more and you can add less, or you can also just guesstimate where you want to place your holes. I do suggest marking them before drilling though, so it's easier and you'll be sure it's evenly spaced out if that's what you're going for. Now we are ready to drill the holes. Just a note again, the drill bit you are using should be best for the screws that you're using. This was slightly bigger than my screw hooks, but I am adding a top coat so the hooks will be sealed and I want it to be able to easily screw the hooks in. When we drill into the holes, some dust from the drilling does get stuck, so similar to the open bubbles, try to clean up the holes as best as possible. We'll probably add a bit of dust when we actually screw in the hooks as well, unfortunately. Here is what one of the hooks look like. I finished up the rest off camera and here is all the hooks in place. Time to prepare the piece for the final top coat. Before we can pour our top coat, we need to protect the back of the piece from resin drips. We are using Elmer's glue for this step and we are spreading it out with a silicone brush. We have to put the front of the piece facing down, but since we have the hooks in place, we're placing the piece on the edge of the table to make sure that the back is flat. We want a nice even layer of glue to make sure that our top coat won't be lopsided. A thicker layer will also help make the peeling easier, but you want to start with just a little bit of glue and then add more. That way you are not overdoing it and having glue spilling all over the edges. The glue has fully dried and now we're ready to pour the final layer of resin. We will place the block on top of some cups so any resin drips will not puddle underneath. To mix our resin, we are using this tote measuring cup. You've seen me use many already because they came with my resin and are reusable. For top coats, we are using Tote tabletop resin. It's their coating resin, which makes it perfect for top coats. It's a 1:1 ratio resin, so I measured accordingly using the measurements on the cup, and after you're done measuring, mix the two parts completely and then we'll pour.
Remember the rules for mixing resin as we mentioned previously. Mix slow and steady with a plastic mixing stick to reduce the amount of bubbles in your mixture. Just a note, before we came into the resin room, I had cleaned up the open bubbles and wiped down the piece with 91% isopropyl alcohol. You should do this before you pour to make sure that your surface is cleaned. To get a good top coat, you want to pour a little bit of resin in the middle and then spread it out to the edges. We are not going over the sides, so you don't want to pour too much and have it spill. If it does spill though, the glue layer is there to protect the back so we don't have to sand. Use a heat gun to pop the bubbles at the surface and slowly add more resin as you go. Since we have the hooks in place, I am using a smaller silicone brush to make sure I get all the edges. Now remember our open bubbles? We do need to pick at it to make sure that the resin fills inside the bubbles. I am using one side of a tweezer. You can just use whatever will fit inside the bubble. Don't skip this step or else the open bubble will just become a bubble again on your final piece and you wasted all the time sanding. Bubbles will continue to rise to the surface until the resin gels. Make sure to check back several times until then to pop the bubbles. Leave the piece to fully harden before you take it out. It's almost time for the big reveal. We did get some resin drip over to the bottom, so it's a good thing we had the glue protection. Now we just have to peel it off to see the final block all shiny. Look at that, the sand marks are all gone and the dome effect makes the block pop up a little bit. The top coat is so shiny and it turned out so nice. Let's see it on a different background and we'll put some earrings on the hooks just to see what this jewelry organizer looks like with jewelry on it.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I went over a lot today, so if you have any questions, leave it in the comments and I'll be sure to get back to you. And don't forget to check out the links in the description, all the products that I use for this tutorial, and my Patreon and the shops. I'll see you next time.